My name is Derek, and I'm a junior in a regular city high school. What could be more boring than the daily grind of school life? Waking up at 7 in the morning, grabbing a quick breakfast, walking to school past gray apartment blocks, attending classes, doing homework, and going to bed. Day after day, week after week. My parents have been divorced for 3 years, and I live with my mom in a 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. She works as a nurse in a hospital, often staying late or taking night shifts, so I spend most of my time alone. I see my dad on weekends, sometimes less often. He started a new family and seems to be trying to forget his old marriage and me. It doesn't bother me too much. I've gotten used to being alone and have even learned to appreciate it. In the quiet of an empty apartment, I could think, read, or sometimes play the old guitar my grandfather gave me when I was a kid. In the evenings, when the lights in the neighboring buildings lit up, I often thought about my life, my future, and what awaited me after high school. I didn't have any grand plans, just to get into some university, earn a degree, and find a job. An ordinary life for an ordinary person. Until recently, my life was predictable and steady. I wasn't an overachiever or a slacker, just average, as my mom used to say. Teachers barely noticed me. Classmates treated me neutrally, and I had neither close friends nor enemies. I blended into the crowd, and that suited me just fine. There was no need to draw attention, answer awkward questions, or maintain relationships. I could quietly observe others, analyze their behavior, and draw my own conclusions. I liked staying in the shadows, being invisible. It gave me a sense of control, even though, in reality, I wasn't controlling anything. But everything changed in September this year, when a new literature teacher arrived. Our previous teacher, Mrs. Johnson, was transferred to another school, and she was replaced by a young woman named Miss Evelyn Harrison. At first glance, she seemed ordinary. Medium height, dark hair tied in a tight bun, pale skin, unremarkable clothes. But there was something off about her. Maybe it was her eyes. Too light, almost colorless, standing in stark contrast to her dark hair. Or maybe it was the way she moved, too smoothly, as if she glided rather than walked. For the first few weeks, nothing unusual happened. Miss Harrison taught her classes as expected. She explained the material, asked questions, and checked homework. But for some reason, she immediately remembered my name, even though it usually took teachers months to learn everyone's names. And I noticed she often looked directly at me. Not at the whole class, as teachers usually do, but specifically at me. Her gaze lingered on my face longer than it should have, and it made me uneasy. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but I gradually became convinced that my suspicions were justified. She was indeed paying me extra attention, even though I gave her no reason to. My answers in class were average, my homework was done without much enthusiasm, and my behavior was impeccable. Yet her focus on me didn't waver. When she explained a new topic, her eyes kept drifting toward me, as if checking whether I was listening or understanding. It was strange because other students behaved much worse, talking, getting distracted, playing on their phones, but she didn't seem to care. At home, I thought about it a lot. Lying on my bed in my room, I tried to figure out what was so special about me that drew Miss Harrison's attention. I looked at myself in the mirror, trying to see what she saw. An ordinary 17-year-old face, light brown hair, brown eyes, no distinguishing features, average height, average build. I wasn't handsome, but I didn't consider myself unattractive either. Just an ordinary guy, one of thousands. So what was it? Did I remind her of someone from her past? A son? A younger brother? A first love? I ran through various possibilities, but none of them seemed convincing. Miss Harrison was too young to have a son my age, and she didn't seem like a mother. There was something distant, cold about her, as if she viewed the world through thick glass. Sometimes I thought she wasn't entirely human, that something alien lurked beneath her exterior. But I pushed those thoughts away, dismissing them as foolish and irrational. The first warning signs appeared in October. Miss Harrison started keeping me after class for various reasons. Sometimes she wanted to discuss my essay. Other times she gave me extra assignments or said I needed to prepare better for class. These conversations happened in an empty classroom after everyone else had left. She would sit at the teacher's desk while I stood in front of her like a guilty student. But she didn't talk about literature or my academic performance. She asked about my family, how I spent my free time, whether I had friends or a girlfriend. Her questions seemed innocent, but there was something unhealthy, obsessive about them. She wanted to know every detail: what time I woke up, what I ate for breakfast, which routes I took to school, what I did in the evenings, when I went to bed, even what books I read at home, what music I listened to, what movies I watched. She was interested in everything about my life outside of school. At first, I answered honestly, not seeing anything strange in it. Teachers sometimes take an interest in their students' personal lives. It's normal. But her questions gradually became more personal, more intrusive. She asked if I had dreams, and if so, what they were about. Was I afraid of the dark? Did I believe in the supernatural? Had I ever seen something unexplainable or felt the presence of invisible forces? These questions left me baffled. I couldn't understand why a literature teacher needed this information. When I tried to dodge her questions or say I was in a hurry to get home, something threatening appeared in her eyes. Not anger or irritation, but something colder, more unsettling. She never raised her voice or reprimanded me, but I felt it was better to answer her questions than resist. In those moments, the air in the classroom grew thick and heavy, like before a storm. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. At home, I tried telling my mom about Miss Harrison's strange questions, but she was too exhausted from work to pay attention to my school problems. She came home late, barely able to stand, ate quickly, and went straight to bed. In the mornings, she left early, leaving me money for breakfast and a note reminding me of household chores. Our conversations were limited to a few sentences about school or weekend plans. When I finally tried to tell her about Miss Harrison, she brushed it off, saying the teacher was just showing concern for her students and that I shouldn't take it so seriously. I tried telling my dad during one of our meetings, but he listened distractedly, constantly glancing at his phone, and eventually said he had more important things to deal with than my school fantasies. His new wife was expecting a baby, and his focus was entirely on his new family. I realized I could only rely on myself, and that realization added to my already growing anxiety. At night, I struggled to fall asleep. Lying in the dark, I thought about Miss Harrison, her strange questions, and the intense gaze she fixed on me after every conversation. It felt like she was still watching me, even outside of school, like her presence followed me everywhere. It was irrational, I knew, but I couldn't help it. My anxiety grew daily, like a snowball rolling downhill, and I didn't know how to stop it. I started avoiding being alone with Miss Harrison. trying to leave the classroom with other students, but she always found a way to single me out. It was as if an invisible thread connected us, preventing me from escaping her attention. Sometimes I thought she could read my mind, that she knew about my attempts to avoid her. In those moments, a faint smile would cross her face, and I knew my efforts to hide were doomed to fail. In November, an incident convinced me that something was truly wrong with Miss Harrison. It was a rainy day, and classes ended early because the school's heating system broke down. I was walking home down a deserted street thinking about the upcoming holidays when I suddenly felt someone following me. It wasn't the sound of footsteps or movement in my peripheral vision, but an instinctive sense of danger. Turning around, I saw Miss Harrison. She was about 50 meters behind me, wearing a dark raincoat with the hood up. The rain was pouring, but she walked slowly, as if oblivious to the weather. Our eyes met for a moment, and she froze, as if rooted to the spot. In her gaze, I saw something predatory, hungry, and my stomach twisted with fear. I quickened my pace, turned a corner, and broke into a run. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. At home, I locked the door with every lock and stood by the window for a long time, peering outside. Miss Harrison was nowhere to be seen, but the feeling of dread lingered until evening. The next day at school, she acted as if nothing had happened. But when our eyes met, I saw something new in her gaze. Knowledge. She knew I had seen her yesterday, knew I was scared, and that knowledge seemed to please her. That day, she didn't keep me after class, but I felt her eyes on me constantly. Even when I didn't look at her, I knew she was watching. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, with me as the mouse and her as the predator, slowly but steadily closing in. During class, she lectured on Gothic novels, fear, and horror in literature, and it felt like she was talking about me, about my state of mind. Her voice was hypnotic, mesmerizing, and I found myself forgetting everything around me, listening only to her. I started noticing other oddities in Miss Harrison's behavior. She never ate in the staff room during breaks, never talked to colleagues, and never participated in school events. It seemed like she only existed during literature classes, vanishing into thin air the rest of the time. A few times, I saw her standing motionless in the hallway, staring at a single point. When other teachers or students passed by, she didn't respond to their greetings, as if she didn't notice them. But the moment I appeared, she came to life, turning her head toward me with that same unsettling intensity. Sometimes I caught her gaze in unexpected places, the library, the cafeteria, a hallway on another floor. She was always where I was, as if she could predict my movements. My classmates didn't seem to notice anything strange about the new teacher. They thought she was strict but fair, praised her knowledge of the subject, and said she made classes interesting. No one complained about odd questions or excessive attention. This made me wonder if the problem was with me, if I was being too paranoid and imagining things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Miss Harrison was acting strangely, and it was directed specifically at me. I was the object of her unhealthy interest, and with each passing day, that interest became more obvious and terrifying. In the evenings, alone in the apartment, I tried to find a logical explanation for what was happening, but nothing rational came to mind. All I could do was wait and hope it would end soon. December brought not only cold and the first snow, but also an escalation of the nightmare that was gradually consuming my life. Miss Harrison was becoming more intrusive, her behavior increasingly strange and terrifying. She no longer limited herself to asking about my life. She began giving me advice that felt more like commands. She told me I should spend more time at home, avoid talking to classmates, and not linger outside after dark. She presented these suggestions as concern for my well-being, but there was a threatening edge to her voice that compelled me to obey without question. I didn't understand where her power over me came from, but I felt that resisting was futile and even dangerous. Every time I showed the slightest hint of defiance, the air around me grew cold and heavy, and something in her eyes made my mind freeze with terror. At home, I started noticing strange things. Sometimes it felt like someone was in the apartment, even though Mom was at work, and I knew I'd come home alone. The sensation came out of nowhere, as if an invisible presence materialized from the air. I searched every room, checked the locks, looked under the bed and in the closets, but found no one. Still, the feeling of being watched never left me. It was especially strong in the evenings while I did my homework. It seemed like someone was standing behind me, looking over my shoulder at the textbook, watching as I wrote. Several times I spun around, but there was only an empty room behind me. Yet the air in those spots was always colder than the rest of the room, as if someone had been standing there, invisible to my eyes. Gradually, I began to realize this presence was connected to Miss Harrison, that she had found a way to invade my home without physically being there. Dreams became my biggest problem. I used to sleep soundly and rarely remembered my dreams, but now I had nightmares about Miss Harrison every night. In these dreams, she appeared in different forms, sometimes as the ordinary teacher, sometimes as a faceless shadow, sometimes as a creature with glowing eyes and sharp claws. She chased me through endless corridors, abandoned buildings, and dark forests. I ran, but she always caught up, grabbing me with her icy hands and whispering something in an incomprehensible language. When I woke, I couldn't recall the words, but the terror lingered all day. The worst part was that in these dreams, Miss Harrison knew things about me no one else did. My childhood fears, secret thoughts, shameful moments from my past. She used this knowledge against me, forcing me to relive my most painful memories over and over. In the mornings, I woke up exhausted as if I'd run a marathon instead of sleeping. Mom noticed my condition but attributed it to teenage issues and winter blues. She suggested I spend more time outside, exercise, or find a hobby. If only she knew the real reason was a teacher who was somehow invading my dreams. But I couldn't tell her. She'd think I was mentally unstable and send me to a doctor. A doctor would likely prescribe pills and put a diagnosis in my file that could affect my entire future. So I stayed silent, endured, and hoped the nightmare would end on its own. At school, things got worse. Miss Harrison no longer hid her special attention toward me. She openly singled me out, asking me more questions and keeping me after class longer. Her explanations grew stranger. She spoke about the dark side of literature, works describing mystical rituals, communication with otherworldly forces, and people transforming into something else. She constantly watched me, as if gauging my reaction to these topics. My classmates started noticing something was off. Jason, who sat next to me, once said Miss Harrison looked unwell, with her overly pale skin and strange eyes. Emily, who usually ignored teachers, complained that literature classes made her uneasy, as if something evil and dangerous was present in the room. But the worst began when Miss Harrison started appearing in unexpected places outside of school. First, I saw her in a store near my house. She stood at the end of an aisle, staring at me without attempting to buy anything or hide. When I tried to approach her, she vanished, as if dissolving into thin air. The cashier, when I asked about a woman in a dark coat, said she hadn't seen anyone like that. The next day, I spotted her in the window of the house across from ours. She stood in a dark room, staring directly at our windows. When I pointed it out to Mom, the window was empty, and she said no one had lived in that apartment for 6 months. Then I saw her on the bus, in the library, in the park, where I went for walks. Each time she appeared suddenly, stared at me with that same terrifying intensity, and disappeared when I tried to get closer. I gradually realized she wasn't just following me. She was studying me, like a scientist observing a lab animal. Her interest wasn't random or driven by human motives. It was something inhuman, predatory, as if she saw me as potential prey. But prey for what? What did she want from me? These questions haunted me, running through my mind endlessly, but I found no answers. The only thing I knew for sure was that Miss Harrison wasn't what she seemed. Beneath the mask of an ordinary teacher was something dangerous and unnatural. In mid-December, an event convinced me of Miss Harrison's supernatural nature. It happened during a literature class while she was discussing symbolism in 19th century poetry. Suddenly, she stopped mid-sentence and looked at me. Her eyes turned completely white, without pupils or irises, and thin black lines like cracks in porcelain appeared around them. The entire class froze, but it seemed no one else noticed the transformation. Miss Harrison kept staring at me with her dead eyes, and I felt something cold and slimy invade my mind. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then her eyes returned to normal. She smiled and continued the lesson as if nothing had happened. After that incident, I lost all ability to focus on school. My grades plummeted, I became distracted and forgetful. Mom grew worried and suggested seeing a doctor, but I refused, unsure how to explain what was happening. What could I say? That my teacher wasn't human? That she invaded my dreams and followed me everywhere? That her eyes sometimes turned white and dead? They'd think I was crazy, so I kept quiet, hoping I could handle the situation alone. But each day, I felt worse, and Miss Harrison's hold over me grew stronger. I started skipping school, missing classes, and making excuses to avoid her. But it didn't help. She found me everywhere. When I stayed home pretending to be sick, she appeared in our courtyard, staring at our windows. When I went to my dad's for the weekend, she somehow knew and showed up near his house. It felt like she knew my every move, my every thought. I realized escape was pointless. She was inescapable. She had chosen me for some reason and wasn't going to let me go. At the end of December, just before the winter break, Miss Harrison finally spoke openly about what had been happening between us for months. She kept me after the last class before the holidays, as usual. But this time, there was something final, decisive in her demeanor. She sat at her desk while I stood in front of her, my heart pounding wildly. The classroom was dark. The winter day was fading and she hadn't turned on the light. Only dim light from the hallway filtered through the slightly open door, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She said she'd been watching me all this time, studying me, and was now certain I was the one she'd been looking for. Her voice sounded different, deeper, with a metallic echo, as if it came from a deep cave. She said I was special, that I had something she and those she served needed. I didn't understand what she meant, but fear choked me, and I couldn't speak. She stood from her desk and approached me, moving with that same unnatural smoothness I'd noticed from the start. When she got close, she reached out and touched my face. Her fingers were icy, as if she'd just held them in a freezer, and her touch sent shivers down my spine. She said everything would change soon, that the holidays were just a delay, and after them, the real work would begin. She had prepared a special program for me to unlock my potential. Her words sounded like a threat wrapped in a promise, and I realized I could no longer pretend this was all in my head. Miss Harrison was truly something supernatural, and I was caught in her web. The holidays, which I'd so looked forward to, now felt like my last respite before an unknown but certainly terrifying future. When she finally let me go, I ran out of the school and home without looking back, knowing she was watching me and smiling her cold, inhuman smile. The winter holidays, meant to be a reprieve, turned into the most terrifying 2 weeks of my life. Miss Harrison didn't leave me alone even during the break. On the contrary, with me spending most of my time at home, her presence became even more palpable and frightening. She no longer confined herself to dreams or occasional appearances on the street. She was everywhere. I felt her presence constantly, like an invisible shadow following me wherever I went. At home, in the store, at my dad's place, everywhere. There's that same cold, metallic smell I'd come to associate with her. It was the scent of old iron mixed with something decaying, faint but distinct enough to make me nauseous. My dreams became so vivid that I started confusing them with reality. Miss Harrison visited me every night, and each visit grew more detailed and horrifying. She told me about her origins, that she wasn't human, but a being from another world that fed on human souls. She explained that she hadn't chosen me by chance. I possessed a unique energy that made me an ideal source of sustenance for her kind. In these dreams, she showed me terrible things, other people she had consumed over the long years of her existence, their withered bodies drained of all life. She said the process would be gradual, that she'd take small amounts at first so I wouldn't notice. Then, when I was weak enough, she'd take everything else. When I woke up, I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't just dreams but real conversations. My body felt exhausted, as if I'd spent hours talking to Miss Harrison. Sometimes, red marks like fingerprints appeared on my arms, and faint scratches marked my neck, marks that weren't there before I went to sleep. When I asked Mom about them, she said I must have scratched myself in my sleep or bumped into something without noticing. But I knew that wasn't true. Miss Harrison was somehow able to affect my body even through dreams, and this realization terrified me. I started noticing changes in myself. I grew weaker, tired more quickly, and lost my appetite. My reflection in the mirror looked increasingly sickly. My skin paled, dark circles formed under my eyes, and my cheeks hollowed. Mom grew worried and wanted to call a doctor, but I refused, afraid that a medical exam would find nothing concrete and my stories of supernatural persecution would land me in a psychiatrist's office. Instead, I convinced her it was just winter blues and a lack of vitamins, that things would get better after the holidays. She believed me, but I could see the concern in her eyes and knew I couldn't hide my condition much longer. The worst part was that Miss Harrison began controlling my thoughts. At first it was subtle. I'd suddenly recall her words from my dreams or catch myself humming a melody I'd never heard before. Then the control intensified. I started thinking about things that had never interested me. Ancient rituals, ways to communicate with otherworldly forces, how to open portals between worlds. These thoughts came out of nowhere, interrupting my normal reflections, and were so alien that I knew they weren't mine. Miss Harrison was implanting her ideas in my mind, preparing me for something horrific. During the holidays, I tried several times to tell my dad about what was happening. He was the only person who might believe me. When I was a kid, he'd told me stories about ghosts and demons, so I knew he didn't entirely dismiss the supernatural. But every time I tried to talk about Miss Harrison, something stopped me. Words stuck in my throat. My tongue refused to move, and I felt a crushing pain in my chest. Miss Harrison was somehow blocking my ability to tell anyone about her, and this realization convinced me I was trapped with no way out. The final days of the holidays were spent in near panic. Returning to school meant facing Miss Harrison directly, and I had no idea what she planned next. In her dream visits, she hinted at a ritual that would take place at school, in a special place she'd prepared for me. She spoke of a full moon at the end of January, when energy portals would be particularly open. Her words sounded like the ravings of a madwoman, but I sensed a sinister truth in them. When the holidays ended, I tried pretending to be sick to avoid school, but Mom checked my temperature, found no signs of illness, and insisted I go to class. On the way to school, I considered turning back and running away several times, but something kept me moving forward. My legs seemed to act on their own, leading me to the place I feared most. My first encounter with Miss Harrison after the break exceeded my worst expectations. She stood at the blackboard in her usual dark outfit, but there was something new about her, something more definitive and menacing. When I entered the classroom, she turned to me and smiled, a smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Her eyes glowed with a cold, lifeless light, and I knew the game was over. She was ready to act. The lesson was tense. Miss Harrison lectured on mystical themes in Russian literature, about Gogol and his demonic characters, about Lermontov and his demon. She kept looking at me as if these works were directly related to our situation. The other students seemed oblivious, but I felt every word was meant for me. She spoke of how demons infiltrate the human world, how they choose their victims, how they gradually take their souls. Her voice was hypnotic, and I found myself drifting into a strange, half-conscious state, almost falling asleep in class. After the lesson, as usual, she asked me to stay. This time there was no dim light from the hallway. She closed the door tightly and lowered the blinds. In the darkness, her figure seemed even more sinister and unreal. She approached me closely, and I felt the cold radiating from her. Her breath was icy, and her skin had a strange grayish hue as if she'd been dead for a long time. She said the preparations were nearly complete, that only a little time remained before she could finish what she'd started. She explained that she chose me not only for my unique energy, but because I was alone. No one would notice my disappearance or would assume I'd run away from home. My parents were too caught up in their own problems, I had no friends, and teachers barely remembered me. An ideal victim for her purposes. Her words stung like lashes, each one painful and humiliating. But the worst part was that she was right. I was nobody to anyone, and my disappearance would likely go unnoticed. She described the ritual she planned to perform. It would take place in the school's basement, a former bomb shelter, where she'd set up a special place where the boundaries between worlds were thin. On the night of the full moon, 2 weeks away, she would conduct a ceremony to transfer my life energy to her and her masters from another dimension. After that, my body would become an empty shell, and my soul would be consumed forever. Listening to these horrific revelations, I felt the last remnants of hope slip away. Miss Harrison spoke calmly, almost casually, as if discussing a lesson plan rather than my murder. To her, I wasn't a person but a mere energy source, no more significant than a battery for a flashlight. This realization hurt more than the fear of death itself. When she finished, she warned me that trying to tell anyone or escape would be futile. She had such control over me that I couldn't speak about her to others or leave the city. I was her prisoner in every sense, despite appearing free. As she let me go that day, she said I had 2 weeks to accept my fate and prepare for what was to come. At home, I sat in my room, desperately trying to find a way out of the trap I was in. But every attempt to think of escape triggered a splitting headache, and any thought of running made my body freeze with fear. Miss Harrison truly had complete control over me, and I knew I couldn't handle this alone. But who could help me? Who would believe such an unbelievable story? And most importantly, who was strong enough to confront a being capable of such things? The solution came unexpectedly. On the 7th day after that terrifying conversation with Miss Harrison, I was sitting in the school library, trying to focus on my homework, but my thoughts kept drifting to the approaching full moon. Only 7 days remained until the ritual, and I could feel myself growing weaker with each passing hour. Miss Harrison had already begun siphoning my energy in preparation for the final ceremony. My hands trembled as I turned the pages of my textbook, and the words blurred before my eyes. That's when Mrs. Collins, the school librarian, approached me. She was an older woman, about 60, who had worked at our school for over 30 years. We rarely spoke. I'd borrow books, she'd check them out, and that was the extent of our interaction. But that day, she sat beside me and quietly asked if I was okay. There was such genuine concern in her voice that I felt a lump rise in my throat. At first, I tried to say, everything was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, tears streamed down my face. The first tears I'd shed in months of this nightmare. Mrs. Collins silently handed me a handkerchief and waited until I calmed down. Then she said something that shook me to my core. "It's about the new literature teacher, isn't it?" I snapped my head up and looked at her. In her eyes, I saw not curiosity or suspicion, but understanding. She knew. Somehow she knew the truth about Miss Harrison. I tried to speak, but the familiar pain in my chest stopped me. Mrs. Collins noticed my struggle and nodded. "You can't talk about her, can you? She's put a binding on you." Her words sounded so natural, as if we were discussing the weather rather than supernatural coercion. "Don't worry, dear. You don't need to tell me anything. I already know what kind of creature she is." It turned out Mrs. Collins was more than just a librarian. In her youth, she had studied occultism and paranormal phenomena, working with a group of researchers who investigated supernatural occurrences. She had suspected something was off about Miss Harrison from the moment she arrived at the school. Too many oddities surrounded the new teacher. No records of previous employment, a refusal to interact with colleagues, and a strange influence over certain students. "She's not the first of her kind I've encountered," Mrs. Collins explained, flipping through an old book she'd brought from her personal archive. "These are beings from a parallel dimension that feed on human life energy. They can take human form, but they can never fully hide their true nature. The problem is, most people simply don't notice the signs of their presence." She told me about her past experiences confronting such creatures. It was never easy and always dangerous, but it was possible. The key was to find the source of their power in our world, their anchor, and destroy it. These beings typically establish an object or place that allows them to exist in our reality. Without it, they can't maintain their human form for long and are forced to return to their dimension. You said she plans to perform the ritual in the school basement? Mrs. Collins asked, and I managed to nod in response. Then that's where her anchor is. We need to get there and find it before she completes her plan. Over the next few days, we secretly prepared to confront Miss Harrison. Mrs. Collins retrieved various items from her collection that could help us. Special candles, consecrated salt, silver amulets, and ancient books with protective spells. She taught me the basics of magical self-defense and simple rituals to weaken Miss Harrison's control over me. Most importantly, she gave me hope. For the first time in months, I realized I wasn't alone in this fight, that someone understood what I was going through and was ready to help. Mrs. Collins didn't think I was crazy or doubt the reality of my experiences. To her, the existence of such creatures was a fact, one that could and must be fought. 3 days before the full moon, Miss Harrison sensed a change in me. The protective rituals Mrs. Collins taught me had weakened her hold, and she noticed. During literature class, she looked at me with suspicion, and after class, she kept me behind as usual. "Someone's helping you," she said, and for the first time, I heard anger in her voice. "Someone's taught you to resist me." Her eyes glowed with that same lifeless light I'd seen before, but now it was brighter, angrier. "It won't change anything, boy. In 3 days, you'll be mine and no one can help you." No, she tried to tighten her control, but the amulet Mrs. Collins had given me protected me from her direct influence. Miss Harrison recoiled as if shocked, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty on her face. "You think some old fool with her books can stand against me?" she hissed. "I've existed for thousands of years. I've consumed hundreds like you. Your protector is only delaying the inevitable." But her words lacked the confidence they once had. Mrs. Collins was right. These creatures had weaknesses, and the right knowledge could level the playing field. The night before the full moon, Mrs. Collins and I snuck into the school. She had keys to every room, a perk of 30 years on the job. We descended into the basement, a former bomb shelter. It was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of mold and that metallic scent I associated with Miss Harrison. In a far corner of the basement, we found what we were looking for. It was a small room, likely once a storage closet, now transformed into a kind of temple. The walls were covered in strange symbols drawn in something dark, possibly blood. A complex magical circle was etched on the floor, and in its center stood an altar of black stone. But the most important discovery was in the corner. On a small pedestal sat an object radiating a faint but palpable aura of evil. An ancient medallion made of dark metal, covered in the same symbols as the walls. It exuded such a sense of malevolence and cold that being near it was physically uncomfortable. "There it is," Mrs. Collins whispered. "Her anchor in our world. Destroy it and she'll lose her power over you." But as I moved toward the medallion, something unexpected happened. Miss Harrison appeared in the room, but not in her usual human form. What stood before us was a nightmarish hybrid of woman and something inhuman. Her skin was gray and scaly, her eyes blazed red, and long claws sprouted from her fingers. Worst of all, she was 3 times the size of a normal person, barely fitting in the room. "Fools!" she roared, her voice like scraping metal. "You thought you could stop me? I'll kill you both right now!" She lunged at us, but Mrs. Collins was prepared. She recited a Latin incantation and threw a handful of consecrated salt at the creature. Where the salt touched her skin, burns appeared, and Miss Harrison howled in pain. This gave me a few seconds to reach the medallion. When I grabbed it, a shock ran through my body so intense I nearly passed out. The medallion was ice cold and burned my hands, but I held on. I could feel the malevolent energy coursing through it, fueling Miss Harrison's existence in our world. "No!" she screamed when she realized what I was about to do. "You don't know what you're doing. Without me, you're nothing. I gave you purpose, meaning." But I wasn't listening. Gathering all my strength, I smashed the medallion against the stone floor. It shattered into thousands of fragments, and a wave of light and warmth swept through the room. Miss Harrison let out a final scream of rage and pain before dissolving into the air like smoke. "This isn't over," she shrieked as she faded. "My kind knows about you now. Others will come. You can't hide forever." But her threats no longer felt as terrifying. The important thing was that her control over my mind vanished instantly. I felt my strength returning, my thoughts clearing, and the fear receding. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. Mrs. Collins helped me out of the basement. We destroyed all traces of the ritual chamber, erasing the symbols on the walls and dismantling the altar. By morning, no evidence of Miss Harrison's lair remained. Officially, Miss Harrison simply vanished. The school administration announced she had personal issues and resigned. No one asked questions. Teachers often change jobs these days. Her position was filled by an older woman who had taught at our school before Miss Harrison's arrival. Life returned to its normal, boring routine. But for me, nothing was the same. The experience of battling supernatural evil changed me forever. I was no longer the quiet, invisible boy I used to be. Mrs. Collins became my mentor, teaching me to recognize signs of paranormal activity, protect myself from inhuman beings, and help others who might face similar threats. Miss Harrison's threats weren't empty. Months later, other creatures did come to our town, searching for me. But now I was ready. I had knowledge, experience, and most importantly, the understanding that even the most terrifying monsters have weaknesses that can be used against them. I was no longer a victim. I'd become a hunter of those who preyed on the innocent. And strangely, this gave my life a purpose and meaning I'd never dreamed of before. Miss Harrison was right about one thing. She did change my fate, just not in the way she planned.